All right, now I wanted to take a quick look at the DCO section of the Juno 106 and see how we might replicate that in rack. And it's nicely laid out here, the functionality in the manual, so let's take it from there. So you can see here, number one, we have two waveforms. You can select the output of the DCO. Each switch can be individually turned on, or you can have both simultaneously. Great, so you can see here we've got a pulse wave, and a saw. So if they can be used simultaneously, and there's no volume for them, they're either on or off. So let's see how we might, using the basic or fundamental modules in rack, let's see what we might do to kind of facilitate that. Let's have a look here. And how will this play with our polyphony setup as well? That's an interesting one. Cool. So here's our VCO. It's got a saw wave and it's got a pulse wave or a square here that we can modulate the width. We need to add them together and then get them into our VCF. Alrighty. So that means we might need some kind of mixer to at least add them together. Again, let's just use the fundamental ones where we can because we're familiar with them. Ooh. Unity. Now, this could be interesting. This doesn't say that it has polyphony though. So you can see here in the tags for the mixer, it says polyphonic at the end of that tag. The Unity doesn't say it's polyphonic, so let's just give that a try. The reason why I'm interested in this is because there's no volume or no volume blend between these two. They're either on or off. There is volume blend for the sub oscillator and the noise oscillator, but these two there aren't. So let's just see how that might be replicated. So we can have up to 6 channels going into this unity function. So let's take that. Oh, that looks like the cable is polyphonic, so maybe that's going to work. You can see they get added together. And let's take the output of that instead and go to here. And that's a monophonic output or not a poly cable. So that's where our problems kind of lie in this idea. So maybe if we use the mixer instead, the fundamental mixer, which is polyphonic, we could, so I'm going to kind of just build this underneath for the moment. So we take the saw output into one, the square from the other, and if we take the mix output, that's also polyphonic too. So that's going to keep our polyphonic functionality going. So that's what we want. If we're going to get really finicky, it says you can turn them on and off with a switch. Let's just see if the mute module allows us to do that polyphonically. Mute, it says polyphonic, so that should be fine. So if we wanted just the switchable function of that, we could first go into the mute and then into the mixer, so we can just turn those on and off. That'll work for us. Great, cool, let's test that out with our sequence. So that's with saw and square. This is just square. This is just saw. And the square, we can modulate the width. So that's pretty much the same. Great. Let's see what else we got. So we can modulate. We'll come back to the modulation side of things in a second. Let's add these last two things over here and see how they might combine with the range. We've got a sub oscillator and a noise oscillator. Let's do the noise first because that's relatively simple. We can add in a noise module. And again, we definitely want to rearrange this later, but let's just do this for now. So the fundamental noise module, we'll just take the white noise out for now. And we can feed that into our mixer. Now, I'm not sure how this is going to work out with the polyphonic nature of this and how this gets mixed together, but let's just give it a go. We might need to add another module in between the mixer and the filter if this doesn't work the way we want, but let's just try that for now. So that's effectively giving us that function here. Then the sub oscillator. So this is just another oscillator. It's a square wave oscillator only, not pulse width, but square, and it's an octave or maybe two below. Let's see if it says controls the volume of the sub. Probably at least one octave, maybe two below whatever these ones are. So let's add in another VCO. Where did that go? There it is. And let's put that in the square output of that into our mixer. You can see that is a monophonic as well. Before I hook up the volts per octave input to our MIDI module, I wanted to address as well this part here where we can select the octave. So we've got an octave module in rack. Is it polyphonic? It is. Cool. So let's think about this for a moment. So really we want all of our voices to be able to switch the octave, because that's what this does here. So instead of going into straight from the volts per octave into our VCO, first we'll go into this first octave module and then into here. And then secondly, again, we're going to rearrange this hopefully, but then secondly, this sub oscillator, or what's going to replace the functionality of the sub oscillator, also needs to be an octave, at least an octave lower than this one. So that says to me, we want to take another oscillator here. And then, yeah, we're going to need to take the volts per octave. Oh, no, this is what we can do. We can take the volts per octave out of this one, into this one, and then into here, and then set this to an octave below whatever this is. So now let's test this out. We can start by turning down the volume of the sub oscillator and the noise oscillator to test this out. So this one here is the sub, this one is the noise. So let's play our chord from, all right, and now let's bring in the noise. Notice the noise isn't on every note, so that's something I wanted to fix later. But let's listen to the sub. There it is. Cool. So we could change the octave of our sub oscillator. And notice also if we change the octave of our other voices, this should be in proportion to that. And just to show this is without the sub and with the sub. So the noise voices we'll come back to in a second, but for now, this pretty much gives us everything here. What else do we have? The LFO. So that's pitch modulation of our oscillators as well. And there's a kind of an amount knob there, which we can very easily do by taking the LFO. Now we haven't looked at the waveform of the LFO, probably a triangle, and putting that into the FM input on the oscillator and our sub oscillator. To make things a little bit more complicated, we probably want them to modulate the same way. So what we need is something that will do the attenuation for us so that we don't have to turn these FM CV knobs the same amount on each. So I'm just improvising here, but that means we'd probably need something like just an attenuator will do the trick. So if we duplicate this one. Take the triangle wave of the LFO into here, and then send that to the VC, the FM on both of our regular oscillator and our sub oscillator. We could then notice that if I turn the modulation up, this is essentially our slider for the LFO modulation of the oscillators. Notice it has no effect at the moment, but we wanted basically one slider to rule them all. So if I turn up the FM CV amount on both of these, we'll hear that now they're modulated. But I can control them both with this. So if I turn this all the way down, and we can kind of pin the range of what's useful by maybe setting these, the FM CV control on both the regular oscillator and the sub oscillator to the same amount, so 50. And you can kind of tune in what the maximum amount of modulation might be. So let's just do 25% for now. And then you've got the speed. And then the amount here. That works nicely, actually. So I'm going to make the FMCV on both the regular oscillator and then the sub oscillator set to 30%, so that they're both the same and now controlled by this slider. Again, this will probably need some neatening at the end, but for now, I think we do have now, we've got range, we've got pitch modulation via the LFO, we've got, one thing we didn't look at is pulse width modulation via the LFO as well. So, and that can be either manual, which means with the slider, or from the LFO. If we just connected the output of this LFO, now it does have its own slider, doesn't it? And we could make a slider for it, but the VCO has essentially its own slider here. So this pulse width from CV. So we could conceivably just do that, and that knob here functions the same as this slider here. And if we wanted it to be manual, we would turn that all the way down and then turn this knob. So that's pretty much the same functionality is available to us simply by connecting the triangle output of the LFO to the pulse width modulation input on just the main VCO. Anything else? We've got our on-off buttons here, as replicated by this mute. So that's both waveforms. Oh, this is just the sub at the moment, so I can turn that down. Both waveforms are off. This is the square. This is the saw, both together. Mix in the sub. And finally, the noise, which we have patched in, but we will look at one other module in a different video to make this polyphonic, so we'll leave that off for now.